A time to pay tribute. Texans come together to celebrate the life of George H.W. Bush.
Talk about a life full of public service. That's what he spent his entire life doing, was helping and serving others.
Now, after the tributes and memorials, we look closer at his life and his lasting legacy in the Lone Star State.
His attention to values, his real belief in the tradition of public service and patriotism.
Remembering a president on this special edition of State of Texas. Hello, and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. The death of President George H.W. Bush brought a week of tributes and memorials that started and ended in the Lone Star State. On Thursday, a second funeral service for Mr. Bush was held at St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston. It's where the president and former First Lady worshiped for more than 50 years. A train carried him to his final resting place, the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum on the campus of Texas A&M University. Thousands of people lined the tracks in cities and towns along the route. They came to pay final tribute to the president. Once the train arrived in College Station, an honor guard took his flag-draped casket to the library. Military aircraft flew a missing man formation over the burial site. George H.W. Bush was buried next to his wife Barbara and their daughter Robin, who died as a child. George H.W. Bush had an outsized impact on Texas politics during the second half of the 20th century. Our Robert Hadlock takes a look at his life and legacy in the Lone Star State.
Connecticut native George Bush moved to Midland in the early 1950s to begin an oil drilling business in the Permian Basin. In 1959, Bush moved his young family and his company to Houston. It was there he became involved with the Republican Party during a time of complete Democrat control of Texas politics. By 1964, Bush became GOP party chairman in Harris County. That same year, he became the Republican candidate for U.S. Senate against incumbent Democrat Ralph Yarborough. Bush lost the statewide race by 12 percentage points. In 1966, Bush made history, becoming one of two Texas Republicans elected to the U.S. House for the first time since Reconstruction. His political career was stymied in 1970 when he was defeated by Lloyd Bentsen in a second run for Senate. After that defeat, President Nixon appointed Bush as ambassador to the United Nations in 1971. He went on to head the Republican National Committee and in 1976 became director of the CIA.
No policy bias will color the collective judgment of the CIA.
In 1980, he set his sights on the White House.
We want Bush! We want Bush!
But was trounced in the Republican primaries by Ronald Reagan, even losing to Reagan in Texas. Reagan later picked Bush to be his vice president. And the pair went on to win two landslide elections.
Thank you for watching democracy's big day.
In 1988, Bush was elected president, only to lose his re-election bid 4 years later. He and his wife Barbara then returned home to Texas. Just 2 years later, the Bush family legacy expanded when his son George W. became just the second Republican elected governor of Texas since Reconstruction.
It never used to be this way, but now I have to worry about my son's schedule, not my own. So when he nudges me and says, "Keep it short, Dad,"
With George W.'s inauguration, a political dynasty continued. In November of 1997, 20,000 people flocked to the Texas A&M campus for the dedication of the George Bush Library.
Today I feel like the luckiest person in the world.
In subsequent years, George and Barbara Bush spent most of their time at home in West Houston, but every summer escaped the Texas heat and headed for the family's seafront compound in Maine. On April 17, 2018, President Bush lost the love of his life. Mrs. Bush's funeral in Houston was followed by burial at the Bush Library in College Station. After a 73-year marriage, George and Barbara Bush will again lie together for eternity in Texas. Robert Hadlock for State of Texas.
In Texas, Republicans dominate politics from the state capitol to the nation's capital, but it wasn't that way in the 1960s when George H.W. Bush started his political career. Steffi Lee looks at how the former president helped build the Texas GOP.
promising to focus on party unity.
Former President George H.W. Bush chaired the Harris County GOP in the 1960s, at a time when Republicans didn't even have a statewide primary.
He was trying to build the Republican Party, and he was just a great person because really in many counties they didn't even have a Republican Party.
Texas Republicans still credit him for putting their party on the map.
We had maybe 2 members of the House of Representatives in the State House, one from Midland and maybe one from Dallas.
And local leaders say as president, he was the driving force behind the city of Houston's continued growth.
He very much wanted to make sure that flood control was addressed to try to mitigate the problem that this area has, being so flat, so wet, and so heavily populated.
President Bush was always committed to making sure that the people of Houston had safe streets, good schools, that we preserved the natural environment of the city.
Steffi Lee for State of Texas.
For a time, George H.W. Bush was arguably the most powerful man in the world.
We had an economy that was functioning quite well and where American leadership was as strong as it had ever been in the world, and he was largely responsible for that.
But how will history remember him? We'll look at how time is affecting the Bush legacy. And at a time when the country seemed so divided, we saw a lot of people put political divides aside to honor President Bush.
I just considered George Bush to be one of the most honorable men I've ever met, one of the most honorable men in politics anyone could possibly encounter.
We'll hear from one of the longest-serving congressmen from Texas about his memories of President Bush. The passing of George H.W. Bush marks the end of an era. He's the last of our presidents from the World War II generation, and he carried the ideals of his time into the Oval Office.
The old ideas are new again because they're not old. They are timeless. Duty, sacrifice, commitment, and a patriotism that finds its expression in taking part and pitching in.
Ideas that ring true for many as they look back on his life and legacy. Joining us for Perspective is Jeremy Surrey. He's a presidential historian and the professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who is an expert in all of this. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me on.
So when we look at presidents from the past century, what makes George H.W. Bush stand out?
I think he stands out for 2 reasons. First of all, he's a president who was in office at a period of transition, the end of the Cold War, the first Persian Gulf War. Many changes occurred in our society during his presidency. And the second thing that stands out is his attention to values, his real belief in the tradition of public service and patriotism.
Some folks credit him for planting the seeds for the Republican Party's dominance in Texas. How big a factor was he actually in the GOP's success?
Well, George Bush played an important role because he was a Republican when Republicans were not popular in the state in the late 60s and early 70s, and he was a part of a new generation. He established the Democratic Party as a minority party by making the Republican Party a more dominant element in the state through elected office, but more importantly through serving at the federal level in the CIA and in various other roles.
A lot of folks remember President Bush for breaking his no new taxes promise. Some saw that as a failing. Others saw a leader who was willing to compromise for the greater good. Is that really a defining moment of his presidency?
It's defining for his legacy in 2 ways. First of all, he was the last Republican president to be willing to make such a bipartisan compromise and commit to a tax package that involved higher tax rates as well as reductions on spending in certain areas. It showed his pragmatism, but it also made him an outcast in the Republican Party. He could never get elected as a Republican today. In fact, he would probably run as a Democrat today.
Wow. Well, Bush is the last of our presidents who saw combat in World War II. How did that experience shape his presidency?
I think as the funeral reflected, it really defined his life. A tradition of public service, but also a sense that he had been spared after what was a near-death experience and a desire, an obligation to serve the public. And I think that generation of World War II veterans believed in the public good, and they believed in working across the aisle in a bipartisan way to solve problems. And we miss that generation today.
Years from now, what do you see as the lasting legacy of this man?
I think there'll be a positive and a negative legacy. The positive legacy is he shepherded the United States out of the Cold War into a post-Cold War world where we had an economy that was functioning quite well and where American leadership was as strong as it had ever been in the world, and he was largely responsible for that. The negative legacy is that the Republican Party did shift under his feet, and following his presidency, we saw the Republican Party move very far to the right, and we saw a rise in partisanship both within our state of Texas and at a national level, and that is part of his legacy too.
Professor Jeremy Suri, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me on.
He served Texas in Congress for more than 30 years. Now he's coming home for good.
I have mixed feelings about leaving, but no regrets. I've been in Congress for 32 years. That's long enough for just about everybody.
We talk one-on-one with Congressman Lamar Smith, what he hopes to accomplish in his final days in office, and his memories of President Bush. Plus, 2 Texas political dynasties connected by the Oval Office. We'll look closer at the history of the bond between the Bushes and the Johnsons. You're watching State of Texas. Honoring the life of George H.W. Bush brought people together this week. They came by the thousands to pay tribute in our nation's capital, at a church in Houston, and along miles of railroad tracks as a train carried his body to his final resting place. Political differences put aside as people came together to remember a leader. Joining us from Washington for Perspective is Congressman Lamar Smith. He's represented Texas and D.C. for more than 30 years. Welcome, Congressman.
Good to be with you and your viewers as well.
Thank you. We want to get your thoughts on the passing of President George H.W. Bush. How do you remember him?
Oh gosh, I only have happy memories about President Bush. I was a junior member of Congress when he was president, but I had gotten to know him over the years just because of his being from Texas and a well-known public figure. But I just considered George Bush to be one of the most honorable men I've ever met, one of the most honorable men in politics anyone could possibly encounter. And he gave me my first ride on Air Force One, and it was going down to San Antonio, my hometown, for the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement at the end of 1992. Turned out I was the only member on the plane. As a steward, a flight attendant came down the aisle, asked me if I'd like to join the president and the first lady in the forward cabin. I thought it was going to be a 5-minute hello. I ended up sitting with the president and the first lady, just the 3 of us, for 2.5 hours all the way down to San Antonio. And we talked about politics, the North American Free Trade Agreement, mutual friends, and so forth. But, you know, that showed the generosity of spirit, how big of a heart President Bush had. He didn't need to spend 1 minute with me. He knew I was a supporter, and he and Barbara Bush gave me 2.5 hours. And those are the kind of things you don't forget, just the decency of the individual that shone through every single day of his life.
That's a great memory. You led an effort this summer to memorialize President Bush. Tell us about that and why it's important for you to pay tribute.
Well, I discovered in walking around the Capitol one day that there were, every now and then I'd see a tree with a plaque on it, and it was dedicated to some individual, some former members, some others. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to write the architect of the Capitol and find out if we might plant a tree and to commemorate the life of George Bush. And I got back a form letter saying, oh, we have to get permission from the Speaker and from the Senate Majority Leader, and we get thousands of requests. And I thought, well, that's the end of that. It was pretty negative. And 2 weeks later, I get another letter from the architect of the Capitol saying, your request has been approved, and in fact, President Bush will be the first president to have a tree planted on the grounds to commemorate his life. This was a couple of months ago, and so we have this wonderful tree very, very close to the Capitol that's there to remind us of how great of a life George Bush led. And I kind of feel like it's great because, as I say, he's the only president to have a tree planted to commemorate his life at this point.
That is great. Congress took time off to pay tribute, and now you're back to work. Once again, we face the possibility of a partial government shutdown. This time, the point of contention is the funding of the border wall. Do you see hope for a solution in the lame duck section?
Yes, I do. We have had this short term called continuing resolution to keep the government funded until December 21st, which is a Friday. Obviously, that's the Friday before Christmas. This was done intentionally. Nothing gets done unless there's a deadline. And when you have a deadline before Christmas, that tends to focus people's attention. And so I do not think we are going to shut down the government. I do hope and expect there to be a resolution, as you just said, involving a wall along the border. And there are other issues involved as well. But, you know, so often Congress just gets right to the edge of the cliff, and we're sort of teetering over the edge before we pull back. And I think that's what we're going to see around December 21st this year as well. There'll be a lot of speculation about the government closing down. I hope we don't. I don't think that really helps things. It doesn't serve the people well. And so I'm still optimistic that we'll reach some kind of an accommodation that will involve the House, the Senate, and the President.
Well, these are your last few weeks at work after more than 30 years of service in D.C. What's that like? You have any emotions?
Yes. Oh, good question. I have mixed feelings about leaving, but no regrets. I've been in Congress for 32 years. That's long enough for just about everybody. I have 30 years worth of friendships up here. I have issues I still care strongly about, and I'm going to keep up with the friends and keep up with the issues too. But it will be nice to spend more time back home in Texas, back home in San Antonio, more time with the family, 2 young grandchildren. And so I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, no regrets about the decision. Congress is in capable hands. 99% of the members of Congress are hardworking, dedicated, diligent, acting as they see in the best interest of our country. So people come and go. The issues stay the same oftentimes, but you know, we just need to remind ourselves we're still a part of the greatest government of the greatest country in the history of the world, and that's enough to make you feel optimistic about the future.
Well, what do you consider your greatest accomplishment in Congress?
Oh gosh, members of Congress, I think, have 2 ways to look at accomplishments. One is the constituents they help back home, and we've been fortunate, I think, to help hundreds, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of individuals back in the district with their interactions with the federal government. Sometimes it's expediting actions by the federal government. Sometimes it's getting decisions made that will benefit them by the federal government. And so there's a lot of satisfaction in trying to make people's lives a little bit easier. Up here in D.C., the satisfaction comes from voting and from also introducing and seeing legislation enacted that you feel benefits everybody in America. I've been fortunate to have been chairman of both the Judiciary Committee and now the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and we've passed a lot of bills, everything from patent reform on judiciary to exploring space and STEM and enhancing and expanding STEM education, getting more funding for research and development with the Energy Department. So we've done a lot on both committees, I think, that are going to benefit a lot of people. And there's a lot of satisfaction in passing legislation. Not easy to do. Only about 1 out of 20 pieces of legislation that are introduced actually become law. And so it takes a long time and a lot of patience and a lot of persistence, but there's been a lot of satisfaction over the years in being able to enact legislation that, as I say, I think will benefit Americans.
Chip Roy will take over your seat in January. Have you reached out to him to give him any advice?
Well, I'm very happy that Chip Roy is going to meet my successor. I just think he has outstanding experience. He is so qualified. He's been a Deputy Attorney General of Texas. He's been an Assistant U.S. Attorney in Texas. He's been a Chief of Staff for a Senator in D.C. So he's got both Washington experience and lots of good Texas experience as well. And I don't know that he needs much advice, but yes, we've had any number of conversations, and he has the same priorities I've had, which is to put constituents first, try to influence legislation in D.C. He will do a great job.
Before we go, how do you want Texans to remember you?
Oh, now, I don't know that I've been asked that question before. How do I want Texans to remember me? I hope as nothing more than someone who worked hard to try to represent his constituents. And they're the ones who I really want to thank for their trust over the years and for re-electing me. And that kind of trust is something that you never forget and that I will continue to appreciate.
Thank you for making time for us. Congratulations on your years of service and good luck with retirement. I'm sure that you have a lot of things that you're ready to get on with.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that.
Have a good day, Congressman. It's an exclusive club with only 2 Texas families as members, the Bushes and the Johnsons, connected by their time in the White House. We'll look closer at the history behind this unique bond next on State of Texas. The funeral for George H.W. Bush brought the current president and all the living former presidents together. It's an exclusive fraternity, only 2 Texas families as members. We're talking about the Bushes and the Johnsons. Wes Rappaport shows us the long-lasting bond between those different first families.
Former first families have a very tight-knit community because we have an appreciation for what it takes to serve.
That tight-knit community comes together when one of its members passes away. Lucy Baines Johnson, daughter of President Lyndon B. Johnson, treasures the Bush dynasty.
More than just President George H.W. Bush, but his father before him, who was in the Senate, have been close friends of generations of Johnsons. We admire them, we love them, we're grateful for them, and we're praying for them.
Johnson and her sister presented President George H.W. Bush with a Liberty and Justice for All award back in 2013 for embodying LBJ's goals to create equal opportunity for all Americans.
The example of public service that both President Bushes and all of their family have given to our country is really makes your spirits soar, because they are folks who believe also that to whom much is given, much more is expected, and they are non-stop givers.
I'm Wes Rappaport for State of Texas.
Thank you again for joining us for this special edition of State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. We'll be back next week to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics.